"You owe me nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain hammering the windows. "I release you from whatever promise my brother extracted on his deathbed. I will not be your obligation. I will not be your burden." The Duke of Ashworth did not move. He stood in the doorway of the cramped boarding-house room, rain dripping from the shoulders of his greatcoat onto the warped floorboards, and he looked at her as though she had just spoken in a language he did not understand, as though the words themselves offended him in a way he could not articulate. "Burden," he repeated. The word came out low, flat, dangerous. "Welcome back to Aristocratic Hearts, where love is a battlefield and the stakes are everything. I'm so glad you're here with me today for another tale of passion, duty, and the kind of obsession that ruins a man completely, in the best possible way. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments, whether it's 3 in the morning and you can't sleep, or you're on your way to work, or you're hiding under the covers pretending the world doesn't exist. I want to know. I love seeing our community span across continents, and I read every single one of your messages. Tonight's story begins with a deathbed promise, the kind that binds a man's honor more tightly than any legal contract. It's about a woman who spent her entire life being invisible, a duke consumed by a guilt he cannot outrun, and what happens when obligation transforms into something far more dangerous, something that devours reason, propriety, and every wall a man thought he had built around his heart. Let me take you back to England, 1847, where the rain fell like a curtain between the present and the past, and where a woman named Rosalind Whitmore was about to have her entire world shattered and rebuilt by a single knock on her door. The knock came at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening in September. Rosalind had been mending the same stocking for nearly an hour, her fingers too stiff with cold to work the needle properly. The room she rented above Mrs. Henley's boarding house in Cheapside was not heated. Coal cost money she did not have, and the single candle she'd been rationing, 1 per week and no more, guttered in its tin holder, casting trembling shadows across walls stained brown with years of smoke and damp. She was 26 years old, unmarried, penniless, and in 3 days she would be homeless. The letter from her stepmother had arrived that morning, delivered by a boy who had not bothered to wait for a reply. Lady Whitmore's handwriting was elegant as always, her cruelty dressed in the fine silk of perfect penmanship. Rosalind's father, Sir Richard Whitmore, Baronet, had died 7 months ago, and with him had died any pretense of familial obligation. The small quarterly allowance that had kept Rosalind alive, barely, on the thinnest edge of survival, was being discontinued immediately. Lady Whitmore had 3 daughters of her own to launch into society, she wrote, and could no longer justify the expense of supporting her late husband's plain, unmarriageable, frankly rather disappointing daughter from his first marriage. Now, it's important to understand what this meant for a woman in 1847 England. A woman alone, without money, without family willing to claim her, without connections or references, existed in a kind of social purgatory that we can barely comprehend today. Her options were brutally, mercilessly limited. She could seek a position as a governess, if anyone would hire a woman of 26, with no experience, no references, and a family that had made it publicly clear they wished to forget her existence. She could become a paid companion to some elderly widow, fetching shawls and reading aloud in drawing rooms until her eyes dimmed and her spirit finally broke. Or she could sink lower still, into the kind of desperate circumstances that respectable people refused to name aloud. There was no social safety net, no charitable institution that could restore her dignity, no path back to the life she had once known. For a woman like Rosalind, poverty was not merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence delivered in slow, grinding inches. Marriage, of course, was the expected salvation for a woman of her birth. But marriage required a dowry, or beauty, or connections, and Rosalind had none of these things. She had learned this lesson at 17, when her stepmother had informed her with poisonous sweetness that there would be no London season, no introduction to eligible gentlemen, no dowry set aside. She was too plain, Lady Whitmore said, too quiet, too forgettable. What man of quality would waste his time on her when 3 beautiful, accomplished, properly dowered stepsisters were available? So Rosalind had made herself small, useful, invisible. She had helped raise those stepsisters, manage the household accounts when Lady Whitmore's reckless spending threatened ruin, and accepted with quiet, unbreakable grace that her life would be one of service and shadows and silence. And then her brother had come home from the war. Thomas, her beloved, irreplaceable Thomas, 4 years her senior, the only person in the world who had ever looked at her and seen someone worth looking at. He had been away for 8 years, serving with the British forces in India and Afghanistan, fighting in campaigns she could barely find on a map. His letters had been her lifeline, irregular, often delayed by months, sometimes arriving 3 at once in a battered packet that smelled of dust and foreign spices, but filled with the warmth and humour and fierce protectiveness that had made him her childhood shield against a household that had never wanted her. When he returned to England 3 months ago, she had barely recognised him. The laughing, broad-shouldered young man who had ridden away to war was gone. In his place stood a soldier with hollowed cheeks, haunted eyes, and a cough that rattled so deep in his chest it sounded like something breaking. The war had cracked something essential in him. The long sea voyage home had finished the job. He had died in her arms 2 weeks ago. Fever, the doctor said, shrugging with the casual indifference of a man who saw death too often to be moved by it. Thomas's lungs had been scarred by the Afghan climate, weakened by old wounds that had never healed properly, and when the infection took hold, there was nothing to be done but wait and watch and hold his hand while the light behind his eyes went out. In his final hours, delirious with fever, shaking so badly the bed frame rattled against the wall, Thomas had spoken of only 2 things: his sister's safety and a man named Ashworth. "He'll come," Thomas had whispered, his fingers gripping hers with a strength that his wasted body should not have possessed. "Promise me, Rosie, when Ashworth comes, you'll let him help you. He owes me his life. He's the best man I know. He'll take care of you. Promise me." She had promised. What else could she do? Her brother was dying, and if agreeing to accept help from some stranger she had never met would give him a moment's peace, she would have promised him the moon. But she had never truly believed the stranger would come. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Why would a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, personally track down a penniless woman in a Cheapside boarding house? Why not send a solicitor, a servant, a politely worded letter? Keep listening. Because the answer to that question changes everything. The knock came a 3rd time. Harder now, impatient. Rosalind set down her mending and crossed to the door. Her bare feet were silent on the cold floorboards. She had sold her last pair of shoes 4 days ago, the leather too cracked and worn to fetch much. But the few coins had bought bread and a precious lump of coal that had long since crumbled to ash in the empty grate. She opened the door, and there he was. She knew him immediately, though they had never met. Thomas had described him in letter after letter, year after year, with the devoted precision of a soldier cataloguing his commanding officer. The Duke of Ashworth, his superior in Afghanistan, the man whose life Thomas had saved at the Khyber Pass. "Cold as a Siberian winter," Thomas had written once, the ink slightly smudged as though he'd been laughing while he wrote it. Eyes that could freeze a man's blood at 20 paces, jaw like it was carved from the side of a mountain, never smiles, barely speaks. But fair, Rosie, decent, honourable in a way that most men only pretend to be. The kind of man you'd follow straight into the mouth of hell itself, because you know he'd never ask you to go anywhere. He wouldn't go first. The man standing in her doorway matched that description with unnerving exactness. Tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the dim hallway light entirely. His face was all sharp, unforgiving angles, a jaw that might genuinely have been hewn from granite, and eyes the colour of a storm rolling over the North Sea. Grey, she thought, or perhaps blue. It was impossible to tell in the guttering candlelight, but whatever colour they were, they held an intensity that made her want to step backward, not from fear exactly, from the overwhelming sense that those eyes saw everything, every mended stocking, every empty cupboard, every moment of humiliation she had ever swallowed in silence. He was drenched. Rain had plastered his dark hair flat against his forehead and soaked his greatcoat through until it hung, heavy as armour, from his shoulders. Water dripped from his sleeves, pooled in the creased leather of his boots, formed a spreading stain on the floorboards at his feet. He looked like a man who had been walking through the storm for hours and had not once considered stopping. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man accustomed to issuing commands and having them obeyed without hesitation, without question, without the faintest whisper of resistance. Your Grace. The title felt foreign on her tongue, unwieldy and grand. She had never spoken to a duke before. She was not entirely certain she had ever been in the same building as one. But what he said next, what this man said to her in that freezing room, would change everything. Everything. May I come in? She should say no. 100 rules of propriety demanded it. An unmarried woman, receiving a man alone in her private room after dark. The scandal would have destroyed her reputation if she had possessed any reputation left to destroy. But the rules of propriety seemed like a cruel joke when applied to a woman in her circumstances. What did she have left to protect? Her honour, her virtue. Society had already decided those were worthless. She stepped aside. The Duke of Ashworth entered her tiny room and immediately seemed to consume it entirely. He was too large for the space, too vital, too overwhelmingly present. The walls seemed to contract around him. The ceiling felt lower. The room that had been merely small suddenly felt like a box. His gaze swept the space in one quick, comprehensive glance, the glance of a military man assessing terrain. She watched his eyes catalogue the bare walls, the single sputtering candle, the narrow bed with its threadbare blanket and flat pillow, the empty hearth where no fire had burned in days. His expression did not change. That hard, carved face revealed nothing. But something moved behind those storm-coloured eyes, something quick and hot and dangerous, something that looked, if she had been forced to name it, very much like rage. "You're freezing," he said. It was not a question. "I am quite comfortable, Your Grace." The lie was so obvious, so pathetically transparent that she felt her cheeks burn with shame even as she said it. Her breath was forming clouds in the cold air. Her lips were blue. She was shivering so badly her teeth rattled, despite her best effort to hold perfectly, dignifiedly, still. He said nothing to her lie. He did not argue or challenge it. He simply crossed to the empty hearth, crouched down with the easy grace of a man whose body was a finely tuned instrument, and began building a fire. She watched, too stunned to protest, as he pulled tinder and matches from his coat pocket. Why did a duke carry his own tinder, and coaxed flames from the pitiful pile of scraps and splinters she had been hoarding? Within minutes, warmth began to bleed into the room. Real warmth. the kind she had almost forgotten existed. Rosalind felt herself moving toward it involuntarily, her frozen fingers stretching toward the heat like starving things reaching for bread. "Thomas spoke of you." "Constantly," the Duke said. He was still crouched by the fire, feeding it carefully, his broad back to her. The firelight threw his shadow large and dark across the opposite wall. In 8 years of service together, I never once heard him speak of another person with such devotion. His Rosie, he called you. His brilliant, brave Rosie, who deserved the whole world and had been given nothing. The name, Thomas's private name for her, the name no one else had ever used, hit her like a fist to the chest. She pressed her hand against her mouth, willing the tears back, willing the grief to stay contained behind the wall she had built to survive it. "He saved my life," the Duke continued, his voice level, factual, stripped of all sentimentality. "At the Khyber Pass in '39, there were 17 of us trapped in a ravine, surrounded on 3 sides by Afghan fighters. I took a rifle ball through the left shoulder, shattered the joint, made my arm useless. I couldn't hold a weapon, couldn't climb, couldn't do a damn thing except bleed. Thomas threw me over his good shoulder and carried me 2 miles through hostile territory while the remaining men covered our retreat. He was hit twice during that march, once in the thigh, once across the ribs. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. I ordered him to leave me behind. 3 times I gave that order. He ignored me every single time." He stood then, rising to his full height, and turned to face her. In the firelight, the brutal planes of his face seemed almost human, almost warm. But his eyes remained the same, fixed on her with a focus so total, so undivided, it made her feel as though she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I owe him a debt that can never be repaid," the Duke said. "He knew he was dying. He sent for me the moment I reached London. And he asked me to make a promise. I know what he asked you to promise." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a grief she could not fully contain. "He extracted the same promise from me. But I release you from it, Your Grace. Whatever obligation you feel, whatever debt you believe you carry, I will not hold you to it. I am not your responsibility. I am not your charity case. And I will not—" She drew a breath that hurt. "I will not be your burden." Silence. The fire crackled. Rain slashed against the window, and the Duke of Ashworth stood in the centre of her miserable room and looked at her with an expression she could not read and did not trust. "Burden," he said again. The word was quieter this time, softer, and somehow that made it worse. "You think I came here out of obligation? You think I tracked you across London, 4 boarding houses, 3 days of searching, questioning every servant in your stepmother's household until one of them finally, reluctantly provided your address? You think I walked 3 miles through a storm that would drown a lesser man, to stand in this room and offer you charity?" She lifted her chin, refused to look away, though every instinct told her to. "Why else would you come?" He stepped closer, then closer again, until he was near enough that she could smell the rain on his coat, clean and sharp, mixed with something warmer beneath it, leather and cedar and the faintest trace of tobacco. Near enough that she could see the individual drops of water caught in the dark hair that fell across his forehead, near enough to count the faint, silvered scars that marked his jaw and temple, souvenirs of the same wars that had killed her brother. "Your brother saved my life," he said quietly, "but that is not why I am here." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases, handled so many times the edges had gone soft as cloth. He pressed it into her hands. "He gave me this before he died. He made me promise to deliver it personally." Rosalind looked down. Her brother's handwriting, shaky with fever, barely legible, scrawled across the page in the desperate hand of a dying man. "Ashworth will explain everything. Trust him, Rosie. He is the best man I have ever known, and he has been waiting for you longer than you can possibly imagine." She read it twice, 3 times. The words made no sense, or they made too much sense, and either way she could not process them while this man stood so close that his warmth competed with the fire. "Waiting for me," she repeated. "I don't understand." The Duke's expression shifted. For one unguarded moment the mask cracked, and beneath the ice and the granite and the iron control she saw something that startled her profoundly, something that looked, impossibly, like fear. "I saw your portrait," he said, "7 years ago. Thomas carried a miniature of you in his breast pocket. I caught him studying it one night by firelight when he thought no one was watching. I asked who she was. He told me about his sister, the sister who had been treated like a servant in her own father's house. The sister who deserved everything the world could offer and had been given nothing but contempt. The sister he would burn down England to protect, if only he could find a way." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice had roughened, as though the words were being dragged from somewhere deep and resistant. "I asked him why you weren't married. He said your stepmother had made certain you never would be. He said you believed yourself plain, forgettable, undeserving of love." The Duke's jaw tightened. "And then I looked at that portrait, and I thought Thomas Whitmore must be the greatest liar in the British Army, because the woman in that painting was not plain. She was not forgettable. She was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen." The room tilted. Rosalind felt the floor shift beneath her bare feet, felt the walls recede, felt reality thin and stretch like fabric pulled too tight. This was not happening. Dukes did not appear in Cheapside boarding houses and speak like this. Dukes did not kneel through rainstorms and build fires for women who could not afford shoes. The world did not work this way. Her world had never worked this way. "I asked Thomas for the portrait," the Duke continued. "He refused, said it was the only piece of home he carried, but he promised me something in return. He said that when the war was over he would introduce us properly. He said that if I was the man he believed me to be, I would see you clearly. And if I failed, if I could not see your worth, then I was not worthy of knowing you." He reached out, slowly, carefully, as though approaching something wild and easily startled. His fingers touched her cheek, just the barest brush, a contact so light it might have been imagined. But the sensation tore through her like lightning through still water. "The war ended 3 years ago," he said. "I returned to England. I waited for Thomas to arrange the introduction. But he was ill, and then he was worse, and then he was dying, and the introduction never happened." His voice cracked, a hairline fracture in granite. "I thought I had lost my chance." "Your Grace, Marcus." The word was quiet but absolute. It left no room for argument. "My name is Marcus, and I need you to understand something, Miss Whitmore, before you release me from any promises. When Thomas asked me to take care of you, to marry you, to give you my name and my protection and every material comfort I possess, I did not agree out of guilt. I did not agree out of debt. I agreed because it was the only thing I have wanted for 7 years. I agreed because the thought of you cold and hungry and alone is so intolerable to me that it makes my hands shake. I agreed because when your brother asked me to marry his sister, the answer was already yes. It had been yes for years. It had been yes since the first moment I saw your face in a portrait painted by a second-rate artist by the light of a campfire in Afghanistan, and it will be yes until the day they put me in the ground. Marry. The word detonated in the small room like cannon shot. "You cannot mean that." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You are a duke. I am nobody. I have no dowry, no connections, no position. I have £40,000 a year. he interrupted. "I have 4 estates, 200 servants, a seat in the House of Lords, and enough social authority to annihilate anyone who dares look at you with anything less than reverence. What I do not have, what I have never had, is someone who sees me as a man rather than a title. Thomas saw me, and from everything he told me about you, I believe you can see me too." And then, with a movement that seemed to cost him something fundamental, some last fortress of pride, some final wall of self-protection, the Duke of Ashworth dropped to his knees. On the bare, cold floorboards of a Cheapside boarding house, in a room that smelled of damp and tallow and poverty, one of the most powerful men in England knelt before a penniless spinster with no shoes and mended stockings, and looked up at her as though his next words would determine whether he lived or died. "Marry me," he said. "Not because Thomas asked it, not because I owe a dead man a debt. Marry me, because I have carried your face in my mind for 7 years and your name in my chest like a second heartbeat. Marry me because now that I have met you, now that I have heard your voice and watched you refuse my help with more dignity than most duchesses possess, I know that the portrait was nothing. The reality of you is more than I ever dared imagine. Marry me because I am asking, Rosalind. I am begging. Give me the chance to prove I can be worthy of you." Rain hammered the glass. The fire crackled and spat, and Rosalind Whitmore stood frozen in the amber light, staring down at the man who had just offered her everything she had spent a lifetime being told she could never have. "This is madness," she said at last. "We have known each other for a quarter of an hour." "I have known you for 7 years. The quarter hour is merely a technicality." Despite everything, despite the shock and the grief and the impossibility of this moment, a sound escaped her, a laugh. It came out rough and startled, rusty from disuse, unfamiliar even to her own ears. She could not remember the last time she had laughed. Something transformed in his face. The severity cracked open and warmth flooded through, into his eyes, across his mouth, through the rigid set of his shoulders, as though her laugh had unlocked something in him that years of war and loneliness had sealed shut. "There," he said softly, "that is what Thomas described. That laugh." "He told you about my laugh?" "He told me about everything. Your laugh. The way you hum while you think, the way you weep at the endings of novels, even novels you've read a dozen times, the way you slip your dessert to whichever child at the table looks hungriest." His voice dropped lower. "The way you deserve so much more than this world has seen fit to give you." Her eyes burned. She would not cry. She had not cried when her father died, had not cried when Thomas was buried, would not cry now because a stranger was kneeling on her floor and saying beautiful things he could not possibly mean. "You are offering me your name out of pity," she said. "Pity." He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, and suddenly he was close again. Too close. His presence filling the room until there was no air left that didn't smell like rain and cedar and him. "Is that what you believe this is? What else could it be?" Something moved in his throat. A low sound, almost a growl. Frustration, perhaps. Or something more primal. Something with teeth. "Then let me show you what this is," he said. He took her face in his hands. Large hands. Warm despite the rain. Slightly roughened by years of holding reins and rifle. Stocks. And tilted her chin until she had no choice but to meet his gaze. "This is a man who has spent 7 years carrying a portrait of a woman he had never met. 7 years imagining what her voice might sound like. 7 years lying awake in a military tent in a country that wanted him dead, wondering if her eyes were truly as luminous as the painting suggested. 7 years telling himself that when he finally stood before her, the reality could not possibly match the impossible, irrational hope he had constructed in his mind. His thumb traced her cheekbone. The touch left fire in its wake, a trail of heat that sank through her skin and into her blood and settled somewhere behind her ribs like an ember that would not go out. "The reality is better," he said roughly. "You are standing in this freezing room with bare feet and a candle that is about to die and 3 days between you and the street, and you are refusing my help because you will not be a burden. You have nothing, Rosalind, and you have more dignity than anyone I have ever known. This is not pity. This is the furthest thing from pity that exists. This is a man who has found the woman he has been searching for his entire life, and he is terrified, genuinely, profoundly terrified, that she is going to slip through his fingers because she has been taught to believe she does not deserve to be caught." She could not breathe, could not speak, could not do anything but stand in the warm cage of his hands and feel the world rearrange itself around her. "I don't know you," she whispered. "Then let me give you time." His hands gentled on her face but did not release her. "Marry me, and I will give you 6 months, a year, whatever you need. Separate bedrooms, no expectations, no demands, nothing but the chance to learn who I am and to let me learn who you are. And if, at the end of that time, you cannot love me," his voice fractured, "I will give you anything you want. An estate of your own, a generous settlement, your complete independence, everything I have. Just give me the chance, Rosalind, please." She had never heard a duke say please. She had never heard anyone say it with such raw, undisguised desperation. "Yes," she said. Marcus went utterly still. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." One heartbeat of silence. Then his arms closed around her, not gently, not cautiously, but with a force that drove the air from her lungs and crushed her against a chest that felt like it had been built to hold her. His face pressed into her hair. His breath came in shuddering waves. His hands spread across her back as though he needed to touch every part of her at once to confirm she was real. "Thank you," he breathed. "Rosalind, thank you." She should pull away. Every rule she had ever learned demanded it, but his arms felt like the safest place she had ever stood, and the warmth pouring off him was melting something inside her that had been frozen for so long she had forgotten it existed. "I have conditions," she said against his chest. He pulled back just enough to see her face, and the smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth, barely there, almost imperceptible, was the most human thing she had ever seen on that carved, severe face. "Of course you do. Name them." "I will not be an ornament. If I am to be your duchess, I intend to be useful. I want to understand the estates, the accounts, the responsibilities. I will not sit in a drawing room and embroider while the world happens around me. Done. I want to visit my brother's grave before we leave London. And I want to know that his memory is being honoured. He deserves more than—" Her voice splintered. "He deserves more than a pauper's burial." "He is not in a pauper's grave." Marcus's voice was firm and quiet. "I had his body moved the day after he died. He is buried at Ashworth Hall in the family plot beside my own parents. There is a marble headstone. I chose the inscription myself. And I have established a charitable fund in his name for the widows and children of soldiers. He saved my life, Rosalind. I will spend the rest of mine making certain the world remembers that." The tears she had been fighting broke through. 2 weeks of believing her brother lay forgotten in an anonymous grave, unmourned by anyone but her, and all that time this man had been honouring him, quietly, completely, without needing to be asked. "Thank you," she managed. He wiped her tears with his thumbs. His touch was impossibly gentle for hands so large. "What else?" She considered. All the things she should demand, all the protections a wiser woman would insist upon. "I reserve the right to add conditions later." His laugh was like hers, rough, surprised, unfamiliar, as though neither of them quite remembered how the mechanism worked. Agreed. He released her, and the reluctance in the gesture was so visible it was almost painful. We need to leave this place. Now. Tonight. I have a carriage waiting outside. My townhouse in Mayfair has rooms prepared for you. A lady's maid, a chaperone, everything proper and above reproach. Tonight? You are standing barefoot on a frozen floor, Rosalind. The fire I built will die within the hour, and you have nothing left to feed it. Yes. Tonight. She should argue, should insist on bans and propriety and the slow, acceptable rituals of courtship. But the cold was real, and her hunger was real, and the eviction notice folded in her pocket was real. 5 minutes to pack, she said. It took 3. Everything she owned fit into a single carpet bag, 2 dresses, a chemise, her brother's letters tied with string, and a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. The only book she had not been forced to sell. Marcus looked at that bag and his jaw turned to iron. She watched him survey the room one last time, those storm-grey eyes cataloguing every detail of its poverty, and she felt shame rise in her throat like bile. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Don't be ashamed. Not of this room, not of the shoes you sold, or the meals you skipped, or the candles you rationed. This was done to you, Rosalind, by people who should have protected you, and I promise you—" Something entered his voice that was colder than the rain, colder than the room, cold as iron in January. "They will answer for it." The carriage ride to Mayfair took 40 minutes through rain-slicked, lamplit streets. Rosalind sat wrapped in his greatcoat. He had draped it over her shoulders despite her protests, ignoring his own soaked shirt with the studied indifference of a man who had endured far worse discomfort in far worse places. The coat was enormous on her, heavy with rain, and it smelled of him. Cedar and leather and something warm beneath, something distinctly, disturbingly male. She tried not to stare at the way his wet shirt clung to the hard lines of his chest. She failed entirely. "You are watching me," he said, without opening his eyes. He had leaned his head back against the seat cushion, apparently at ease, though she noticed his hands were clenched, white-knuckled in his lap. "I am trying to determine whether I have gone mad," she admitted. 3 hours ago, I was calculating whether my last sixpence could stretch to cover 2 more days of bread. Now I am in a duke's carriage, wearing a duke's coat, travelling to a duke's house. The transition feels somewhat abrupt. Would you have preferred I sent a calling card and waited until Thursday? It would have been more conventional. I have never once in my life been accused of being conventional. He opened one eye. Grey. Definitely grey, she decided in the lamplight, with flecks of something darker at the centre. Does that trouble you? I have not decided yet. That smile again, just the corner of his mouth, barely a movement, but it transformed the brutal geography of his face into something almost warm. "Fair," he said. The townhouse in Mayfair was nothing like she had anticipated. She had braced for oppressive grandeur, gold leaf and cold marble, and the kind of suffocating opulence that would remind her with every breath of exactly how far she was from belonging. Instead, the house was warm, rich, certainly. The furniture was excellent, the paintings clearly original, the carpets thick enough to swallow her bare feet entirely, but warm. Books crowded every surface. Fires blazed in every hearth. Fresh-cut flowers spilled from crystal vases on hall tables, their fragrance sweet and startling in the autumn air. "This is your home?" She could not keep the surprise from her voice. "One of them. I have estates in Derbyshire and Northumberland as well. But this is where I live when Parliament demands my presence." He was watching her reaction with an attention that bordered on anxious, as though her opinion of his wallpaper mattered more than a vote in the House of Lords. "It is beautiful," she said honestly. It feels lived in. Something eased in his expression. I cannot abide houses that feel like museums. If a place cannot hold the smell of wood smoke and old books, it is not worth inhabiting. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldworth, a sensible-looking woman of middle years with kind eyes and an impeccably starched cap, appeared as though summoned by instinct. Marcus introduced Rosalind with a quiet authority that left no room for confusion. Miss Whitmore is my guest, and will be treated as the mistress of this house. Whatever she needs, she receives, without question, without delay. Is that understood? Perfectly, Your Grace. Mrs. Aldworth curtsied to Rosalind with precisely the deference she would show a duchess. Your rooms are prepared, miss. Shall I send up a bath and a supper tray? A bath, hot water, food that was not stale bread gnawed in the dark. Rosalind's eyes burned treacherously. Yes, please, thank you. Mrs. Aldworth vanished, and Marcus turned to her. I will leave you to rest. We can discuss the arrangements tomorrow. Arrangements? The wedding, the license, the... He hesitated, and for the first time something uncertain flickered across his face. All of it. But tonight you sleep. In a warm room, in a proper bed, with a full stomach. That is the only thing that matters tonight. He turned to leave. She caught his sleeve. The gesture startled them both. Marcus. It was the first time she had used his name. She felt the impact of it in the way he went absolutely still, the way his breathing changed, the way the muscles in his arm tensed beneath her fingers as though she had touched bare skin instead of wet linen. Thank you, she said, for coming, for all of it. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then he covered it with his own, warm, large, steady. I would have come sooner, he said, if I had known what you were enduring. I will carry that failure with me for the rest of my life. Then he was gone, striding down the corridor, with the controlled energy of a man who needed to leave before he did something he had promised not to do. Rosalind stood alone in the hallway of a duke's townhouse, wrapped in his coat, her hand still warm where he had held it. She was going to marry this man, this impossible, overwhelming, quietly devastating man who knelt on bare floors and built fires and spoke of 7-year obsessions as though they were the most natural thing in the world. She was either the bravest woman in England or the most foolish, possibly both. But for the first time since Thomas had left for the war, Rosalind Whitmore felt something she had long since abandoned as a childish fantasy. Hope. What happened next would test that hope to its very limits. But before we get there, let me tell you about the 3 weeks that changed everything. Marcus procured a special license with the same efficient ruthlessness he applied to everything else. Now, it is worth pausing to explain what a special license meant in 1847 England, because the distinction matters enormously. Under ordinary circumstances, a marriage required either the reading of banns in the couple's parish church for 3 consecutive Sundays, a public announcement that invited gossip and scrutiny, or a common license, which dispensed with the banns, but still required the ceremony to take place in a church within the diocese. A special license, however, was an entirely different instrument. Issued only by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, it allowed a couple to marry at any time, in any location, a private chapel, a drawing room, a garden. It cost a staggering sum and carried an unmistakable social message. This is a man whose power and influence extend to the highest ecclesiastical authority in the land. When the Duke of Ashworth presented his special license, he was not merely arranging a wedding. He was issuing a statement. He was saying, I answer to no one. During those 3 weeks, Rosalind was fitted for an entirely new wardrobe by a Bond Street modiste, whose previous clients included 2 duchesses and a princess. She was given a lady's maid, a chaperone, access to one of the finest private libraries in London, and the bewildering daily attention of a man who seemed incapable of allowing her to want for anything. When she mentioned offhandedly that she had once dreamed of studying botany, a crate of books on the subject appeared in the library the following morning, accompanied by a letter of introduction to the director of Kew Gardens. When she said she missed playing the pianoforte, her stepmother had sold the instrument her mother had left her, a Broadwood grand was installed in the morning room before the week was out. "You must stop doing this," she told him. "Every time I mention something I once enjoyed, it materializes in this house within a day. Give me one compelling reason to stop. It is excessive." "I earn 40,000 a year and have nothing worthwhile. To spend it on, making you happy is the most efficient use of capital I have ever discovered." She did not know what to do with him. He demolished every assumption she had ever built about powerful men. He was arrogant, yes, supremely, almost absurdly confident in all matters, except she was learning matters that involved her. Around her, that granite certainty developed hairline fractures, moments of hesitation, flickers of vulnerability that she found devastating, like the morning she discovered him in the library reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, a Gothic romance she had mentioned loving as a girl. He looked up at her with the expression of a man caught committing a crime. "Research," he said flatly. "You are reading Mrs. Radcliffe. I am conducting a thorough investigation into your literary preferences for strategic purposes. You are on volume 2. I am exceptionally thorough." She laughed, that rusty, unpracticed sound that grew warmer and easier each day, and watched the effect of it on his face. Watch the ice melt, the hardness soften, watch something luminous move behind his eyes like sunlight breaking through winter cloud. He was falling in love with her. Not with a portrait, not with a brother's stories, not with the idea of her, but with the real, complicated, difficult, astonishing reality of the woman standing before him. She could see it happening in real time, layer by layer, like watching spring arrive. She was not immune. She was not remotely immune. But she did not tell him. Not yet. Not while the ground beneath her still felt like glass that could shatter with one wrong step. The incident with Lord Harcourt occurred during the second week. Marcus had arranged a small dinner party to begin introducing Rosalind to the social circles she would soon inhabit. The guest list was curated with military precision. 2 married couples of spotless reputation, a widowed countess known for her generosity, and Viscount Harcourt, a former military colleague who had served alongside Marcus and Thomas in Afghanistan. The evening proceeded smoothly until after dinner, when the party reconvened in the drawing room. Harcourt, handsome, easy-mannered, possessed of the thoughtless charm that comes from a lifetime of being effortlessly liked, approached Rosalind at the pianoforte, where she had been persuaded to play a short piece by Handel. "Thomas never mentioned his sister was so accomplished," Harcourt said, leaning against the instrument with casual familiarity. "He did mention she was beautiful. I confess I assumed he was being generous. I see now he was understating the case considerably. A perfectly ordinary compliment, a perfectly acceptable social pleasantry. There was nothing improper about it. But from across the room the temperature plummeted. Rosalind looked up. Marcus stood by the mantelpiece, brandy glass in hand, and he was staring at Harcourt with an expression that turned her blood to ice water. His face had not changed, the same aristocratic mask, the same granite composure, but his eyes had gone to a colour she had never seen in them before. Not grey, not blue, something closer to steel, freshly sharpened and infinitely dangerous. "Harcourt," Marcus's voice was pleasant, conversational, absolutely lethal. "I believe my betrothed has finished her piece. You might allow her some air." The word betrothed landed in the room like a blade thrown into a table. Every head turned. Every conversation ceased. The meaning was unmistakable. Harcourt, to his credit, understood the danger instantly. He straightened, stepped back from the pianoforte, and inclined his head with the measured retreat of a man who recognized a territorial claim when he heard one. "Of course, Ashworth. My apologies." Marcus crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not touch Rosalind. They were in company, and physical possessiveness would have been scandalous, but he positioned himself at her shoulder with the unmistakable precision of a man establishing a perimeter. "You are well?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. "Perfectly well." He was merely being polite. "He was looking at you," Marcus said, "as though you were available. You are not available. You have not been available since the moment I saw your portrait in a firelit tent in Afghanistan. And if he looks at you that way again, I will ensure he understands this using whatever means I find most satisfying." "Marcus, he is Thomas's friend." "He is a man who looked at you with an expression I did not care for. The two facts are not mutually exclusive." She should have been alarmed by the possessiveness in his voice, the cold, absolute, slightly unhinged quality of it. Instead, something warm uncurled in her chest, something that felt alarmingly like being wanted. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had settled into silence, she found him in the library. He stood at the window, staring into the dark street below, his brandy untouched on the sill. "You frightened Lord Harcourt," she said. "Good. That is not a proportionate response to a compliment." He turned. In the lamplight, his face was half shadow, half gold, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that made rational thought difficult. "You are correct," he said. "It is not proportionate. Nothing I feel about you is proportionate. I have spent 7 years building a monument to a woman in a portrait, and now that the woman is real and standing in my house and laughing at my reading choices—" He stopped, drew a breath that visibly cost him. "I find that I cannot be reasonable about you. I have tried. I cannot. I have not asked you to be reasonable. No, you have asked me to be patient, which is considerably harder." She crossed the room, stood before him, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. "Patience," she said, "is not the same as suffering. You are allowed to hope, Marcus." Something broke open in his expression, raw, unguarded, blinding. "I have done nothing but hope," he said, "for 7 years. She did not kiss him, not yet. But she placed her hand over his heart, felt it hammering against her palm like a caged, desperate thing, and she let him see in her eyes that his hope was not misplaced. They were married on a grey October morning in the private chapel at Ashworth Hall in Derbyshire. The chapel was ancient. 5 centuries of Ashworth marriages consecrated between its stone walls, and the air smelled of beeswax candles and old wood and the white roses that the head gardener had coaxed into bloom specifically for this day. Rosalind wore ivory silk. Marcus stood at the altar in dark superfine, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture she had come to recognize as controlled intensity. When she appeared in the chapel doorway, she saw his hands tighten, saw his throat move, saw his eyes travel over her with a hunger so intense it should have been indecent in a house of God. The vicar spoke the words. Marcus's voice was steady when he made his vows. Rosalind's trembled. "With this ring," he said, sliding a band of warm gold onto her finger, "I thee wed." Now I have to tell you something about what this moment truly meant, because the romance of it can obscure the reality. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed English law in this period, Rosalind had just legally ceased to exist as an independent person. The moment she spoke her vows, everything she possessed became her husband's property. Any money she might earn was his. Any contracts she might wish to sign required his approval. Even her own children, should she have them, would belong to him in the eyes of the law. She could not sue, could not be sued, could not appear in court as an independent party. In the most literal legal sense, she had just handed her entire existence to a man she had known for 3 weeks. The trust that required, the sheer breathtaking courage of it, was almost impossible to fathom. The first month of marriage unfolded exactly as Marcus had promised. Separate bedrooms, no expectations, meals taken together, long walks through the vast Derbyshire estate, and conversations, hours of them winding and layered and increasingly intimate, that peeled back the armour both of them wore and exposed the vulnerable, complicated people underneath. Rosalind took to the estate with an aptitude that startled everyone except Marcus. Her years of managing Lady Whitmore's chaotic household had sharpened her instincts for numbers and organisation into something formidable, and within a fortnight she had identified errors in the quarterly accounts that the steward had been overlooking for years. "You have found discrepancies that 3 professional auditors missed," the steward informed Marcus, his expression balanced between admiration and professional mortification. Marcus looked at Rosalind across the estate office. "I know," he said, and the pride in his voice was so quiet and so total that it made her cheeks burn. She told herself the warmth spreading through her chest was satisfaction at being useful. She was lying. But what happened next is where the story darkens. And trust me, you are not prepared for what Lady Whitmore did. The letter arrived 6 weeks after the wedding, addressed to the Duke of Ashworth, bearing the seal of Lady Whitmore. Marcus opened it at the breakfast table, read it in absolute silence, and then set it down with the kind of deliberate, measured calm that Rosalind had learned to recognize as barely contained fury. "What is it?" she asked. He slid the letter across the table without a word. Rosalind read it. The blood left her face. Lady Whitmore was coming to visit, but she was not coming alone. She was bringing her eldest daughter, Sophia, 22, golden-haired, widely considered the most beautiful of the 3 stepsisters, and she was bringing her with a very specific, very deliberate purpose. She had heard, Lady Whitmore wrote in her exquisite, venomous penmanship, that the Duke of Ashworth had married her stepdaughter out of some tragically misplaced sense of obligation to a dead soldier. She wished to discuss the situation in person. She also wished to introduce dear Sophia, who was so much more suitable for a man of his Grace's extraordinary standing. After all, she wrote, a duke's wife should be an asset, not an embarrassment. The implication was not merely clear, it was a declaration of war. "I see," Rosalind said. "You see?" Marcus's voice was dangerously soft. "Is that all?" "What would you have me say?" "I would have you be furious." She looked at him. His face was white with rage, a cold, focused, terrifying rage that she had never seen directed at anyone before. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down as though he needed something solid to prevent himself from standing up and breaking things. "Fury is a luxury reserved for people who have power," Rosalind said quietly. "I spent 26 years learning that my anger changes nothing." "You have power now?" His eyes blazed. "You are the Duchess of Ashworth. Your word can make or unmake every social ambition that woman possesses. You have the power to annihilate her, Rosalind, and I am going to help you do it." Something stirred in her chest. Not hope. Something older and darker and far more satisfying. Something that tasted like the justice she had never been permitted to want. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus rose from his chair and circled the table until he stood directly behind her. He leaned down, one hand braced on the back of her chair. his mouth close enough to her ear that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "I am proposing," he said, "that we invite your stepmother into our home, that we receive her with every courtesy, that we let her see exactly what you have become. And then—" his voice dropped to something soft and precise and absolutely terrifying. "We show her what happens when someone hurts what is mine." Rosalind turned her head. His face was inches away. She could see the individual flecks of darker grey in his irises, could feel the coiled tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "I belong to myself," she said. "Yes," he agreed instantly, "and I belong to you, which means that anyone who has ever caused you pain has made an enemy they cannot begin to comprehend." "Very well," she said. "Invite them." His smile was beautiful, and it was merciless. Now I need to pause here and explain something crucial about what a duke could do to someone in Victorian England, because without understanding this, you cannot understand the scale of what Marcus was about to unleash. A duke occupied the absolute pinnacle of the aristocratic hierarchy, outranked only by the royal family themselves. His social influence was not merely significant, it was gravitational. When a duke decided to destroy someone's standing, it was not a conflict, it was an extinction. Lady Whitmore, the widow of a minor baronet with champagne ambitions and gin finances, had no earthly idea what she had provoked. Marcus dispatched his solicitor, a razor-minded man named Crawford, to investigate Lady Whitmore's affairs with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation. Crawford returned within the week, carrying a dossier that should have made Lady Whitmore's blood run cold. The findings were devastating. Lady Whitmore had spent the entirety of Sir Richard Whitmore's estate. But worse than extravagance was theft. She had systematically embezzled £700 from Rosalind's maternal trust, money left by Rosalind's dead mother, held in a legal trust that was supposed to be untouchable. Lady Whitmore had forged documents, bribed a compliant solicitor, and drained the fund over 8 years while telling Rosalind she was a financial burden on the family. £700. It does not sound like a fortune. But for a woman in Rosalind's position, it would have meant independence. It would have meant a small cottage, a modest income, a life of dignity instead of destitution. Lady Whitmore had stolen not just money, she had stolen Rosalind's future. "She told me I was expensive to keep," Rosalind whispered, staring at the documents. "She made me feel guilty for every mouthful of food, every candle, every stitch of clothing, and the entire time she was robbing me." Marcus's hand closed over hers. "She will answer for every penny and every tear." And she did, but not in the way she expected. Lady Whitmore arrived on a Friday afternoon in November, in a hired carriage she had borrowed money to rent. She brought Sophia, golden-haired, beautifully dressed in a gown that was fashionable but faintly past its prime, and the swaggering confidence of a woman who had manipulated people for so long she had forgotten that some people could not be manipulated. Rosalind met them in the entrance hall, wearing deep blue silk, sapphires at her throat, her hair arranged by a lady's maid who had previously served a countess. She looked exactly like what she was, the Duchess of Ashworth, untouchable. Lady Whitmore's face, when she entered and saw her stepdaughter, was a masterpiece of barely concealed shock. Marcus materialized behind Rosalind and placed his hand at the small of her back. The gesture was subtle. The message was nuclear. "My wife wished to receive you," he said, with a smile that could have frozen the Thames. "I deny her nothing." Dinner that evening was attended by 2 additional, strategically chosen guests. The Countess of Pemberton, one of the most formidable social arbiters in England, and her husband the Earl, who sat on the committee governing the guest list for every important event of the London season. The killing blow came over dessert. "Rosalind was always such a quiet girl," Lady Whitmore said, her voice dripping honey. "We worried about her terribly, didn't we, Sophia?" "I was quiet," Rosalind agreed, her composure flawless. "It is remarkable how quiet one becomes when one is not permitted to speak." The silence that followed could have cracked glass. Marcus set down his wine. "My solicitor," he said pleasantly, "has prepared a rather thorough account of exactly what Miss Whitmore was not permitted to do. Shall I share the details? The Countess does enjoy a compelling narrative." He laid it all out. The embezzlement, the forged documents, the bribed solicitor, the stolen inheritance, every word delivered in the same calm, conversational, absolutely devastating tone of a man who had commanded troops in hostile territory and understood that the most effective weapon in any arsenal was precision. "You have two options," Marcus concluded. "A public prosecution that will destroy your reputation and your daughter's, marriage prospects entirely, or a private resolution, full repayment with interest, a witnessed letter of apology, and a legally binding agreement that you will never speak my wife's name except with reverence. You have until breakfast to decide." The Countess of Pemberton dabbed her napkin and murmured, "Most entertaining dinner I have attended in a decade." Lady Whitmore signed the documents at 7 the next morning and was gone by 8. Sophia lingered. She found Rosalind alone in the morning room, twisting her gloves, her beautiful face ravaged with shame. "I am sorry," she said, "for all of it, for never defending you." Rosalind looked at her stepsister, another victim of the same cruel woman, shaped by the same house, just from the opposite side of the bars, and felt not anger, but compassion. "Write to me," Rosalind said. "If she turns on you, I will help. That is a promise." "You showed her mercy," Marcus said from the doorway, after Sophia had gone. "Mercy is not weakness," Rosalind replied. "It is the most terrifying kind of strength, because it proves you had the power to destroy and chose not to." Marcus stared at her for a long, charged moment. Then he crossed the room in 3 strides, took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a careful kiss. It was the kiss of a man whose restraint had been eroding for weeks and had finally, completely collapsed. His mouth moved over hers with a hunger that stole coherent thought, and his hands, those steady, controlled hands, trembled against her face. "Tell me to stop," he breathed against her lips. "No." "Rosalind, I love you." The words came out steady and certain and shocked them both. She had never said them to anyone, but standing here, kissing this impossible man who had destroyed her enemies with the same hands that had built her a fire in a freezing room, the words felt as natural as breathing. His eyes closed. His forehead dropped to hers. "Say it again." "I love you, Marcus." "Again." "I love you." His arms crushed her against him, and she felt the shudder that ran through his entire body, not from cold, not from restraint, but from the overwhelming force of hearing the words he had been waiting 7 years to hear. "The door between our rooms," she said, muffled against his chest. "What about it?" "Open it tonight." The door was opened that night. It was never closed again. "Can I just tell you? This is the moment that undoes me. Every time. This man, this feared, powerful, armoured man who spent 7 years dreaming of a woman in a portrait, 7 years of silence and patience and desperate, unspoken hope. And then she says 3 words, and the fortress falls. That is what love does. It finds the one person with the key and hands them everything. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Rosalind's life, but happiness, as you know if you've been listening to these stories, is always the calm before something terrible. And what happened next nearly destroyed everything. It happened on a December morning, 3 weeks after Lady Whitmore's humiliation. Rosalind had taken the small pony trap to visit the Eastern tenants, as she did every Tuesday, delivering bread from the manor kitchen, checking on the children enrolled in the school she had established. Marcus had offered to accompany her, as he always did. She had declined, as she always did. It mattered to her that the tenants saw her as someone who came to them independently, on her own terms. The roads were treacherous. December had descended on Derbyshire with brutal force, freezing rain that turned the lanes to glass, a bitter wind that cut through wool like it was paper. The pony was sure-footed, but the hill above Thornton's Beck was steep, and when the wheel struck a ridge of frozen mud, the trap lurched sideways with a violence that threw Rosalind from the seat like a rag doll. She hit the frozen bank, slid, and plunged into the creek. The water was not deep, perhaps 2 feet at most, but the current was savage, swollen by days of rain, and the cold was a physical assault. It hit her like a wall of iron. Her lungs locked, her muscles seized. Her heavy woolen dress, soaked through in an instant, dragged at her limbs like chains, pulling her toward the deeper channel where the water ran fast and dark between ice-crusted rocks. Now, I want you to understand something about what cold water does to the human body, because this is not dramatic exaggeration. This is medical reality. When the body is submerged in near-freezing water, the muscles begin to fail within minutes. The fingers lose their grip, the legs lose their power, the blood retreats from the extremities to protect the vital organs, and the mind, starved of warm blood, begins to fog, to slow, to surrender. In 1847, the science of hypothermia did not exist, but the reality of it killed people every winter in every county in England. Rosalind had perhaps 4 minutes before the cold took her. She fought. She clawed at the rocks, at the frozen bank, at anything solid. She screamed, but the water rushed into her mouth and turned the scream to choking. She hauled herself halfway onto the bank, and the mud crumbled beneath her fingers, and she slid back into the current. She was going to die, in a creek, alone, within sight of her own estate, and then hoofbeats, thundering across the frozen field, coming fast, impossibly fast, as though the rider had been born in the saddle, and death itself could not keep pace. Marcus. He came over the ridge at a full gallop, his horse's hooves throwing up frozen earth like shrapnel. He did not slow. He did not dismount gracefully. He threw himself from the saddle while the horse was still moving, hit the ground at a run, and crashed into the creek without breaking stride. The water hit him to the waist. He did not flinch. He waded through the current as though it were nothing, as though freezing water and slick rocks and the real immediate possibility of his own death were minor irritations, and his arms closed around her with a force that drove the breath from her body. "I have you." His voice was steady. His hands were not. "I have you, Rosalind. Hold on to me." He carried her out of the water, up the bank, across the frozen field. He stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around her shaking body, and then he lifted her onto the horse and mounted behind her and held her against his chest and rode for the manor at a speed that should have killed them both on the icy ground. She was shaking so violently she could not speak. Her teeth struck together so hard she tasted blood. But his arms around her were iron, and his chest behind her was warm, and his voice in her ear repeated the same words over and over and over, like a vow he was making to God. "I have you. I have you. I have you." The doctor came within the hour. Hot bricks wrapped in flannel, warmed blankets, broth, and brandy, and a fire built so savagely high it turned the bedroom into a furnace. Marcus refused to leave her side. He sat in the chair beside her bed for 3 days, sleeping in fragments, eating nothing, watching her breathe with the fixed, unblinking concentration of a man who believed that if he looked away, even for a moment, she would stop. On the second night, the fever that had taken hold began to break. Rosalind surfaced from fitful sleep to find his head resting on the edge of her mattress, his hand wrapped around hers, and his face, even in the shallow waters of exhausted sleep, carved with a grief so absolute it frightened her. "Marcus!" His eyes opened instantly, alert, immediate, already afraid. "You have not slept," she whispered. "I will sleep when you are well." "I am well." "You nearly died." His voice cracked along a fault line she had never heard before. "The pony came back without you, without the trap. I don't remember saddling my horse. I don't remember the ride. I remember hearing the water and seeing you in it and understanding that if I did not reach you in time, nothing else in my entire life would ever matter again." She touched his face. He turned into her palm and pressed his lips against it, and the sound he made, a raw, broken, grateful sound, told her more about the depth of his feeling than 7 years of waiting ever could. When she was strong enough to walk, a week after the accident, Marcus led her to a room she had never entered, his private study, the one door in the manor she had never opened, the one space he had kept entirely his own. The room was small and warm, lit by a low fire, but it was the desk that stopped her heart. On it sat a miniature portrait in a silver frame. Her face, painted when she was 19 by a travelling artist Thomas had hired as a birthday gift. She had thought it lost years ago, sold by her stepmother with everything else. Beside the portrait lay a stack of letters tied with a leather cord worn soft from handling. Thomas's letters to Marcus, dozens of them spanning 8 years, and among them pressed wildflowers, a fragment of sheet music in her handwriting, a ribbon, pale blue, frayed at the edges, that she recognized with a shock that buckled her knees. It was hers, from her hair, from a lifetime ago. "Thomas gave me the portrait before he died," Marcus said from the doorway. "The letters I kept, the rest, the flowers, the ribbon, the music. Thomas collected them for me, over the years. Small things you had discarded or forgotten. He knew I would want them. He knew before I did." "You kept all of this?" Her voice was barely audible. "For years?" "Since the first time I saw your face in that painting. I knew it was irrational. A sane man does not build a shrine to a woman he has never met." A pause. The faintest ghost of that rare smile. "I have never claimed to be entirely sane where you are concerned." She turned to face him. "This man, this impossible, devoted, slightly unhinged man who had carried fragments of her through years and wars and the vast, impossible distance between a dream and the living, breathing, complicated truth." "Come here," she said. He came. And when she kissed him, still weak, still trembling, still tasting of fever and firelight, she felt him break apart and reassemble himself around her, as though she were the only architecture that had ever made sense of him. But 3 days later, she found the second dossier, and it nearly ended them. It was in his desk. She had gone to retrieve a book and found the folder open, the name at the top unmistakable: Lord Harcourt. Marcus had conducted a full investigation into the man, financial records, personal debts, social vulnerabilities, and at the bottom, in Marcus's precise hand, a plan to systematically destroy a man whose only offence had been paying Rosalind a compliment at a dinner party. The confrontation was devastating. "He told me I was beautiful," Rosalind said, her voice shaking with anger. "For that, you would ruin him." "He looked at you as though—" "Men look at women, Marcus. It does not require annihilation." Silence, long and terrible and full of the sound of something fracturing. "I cannot control it," he said at last, and his voice was raw. This thing I feel for you is not rational. When I saw him lean toward you, something cracked in me that I cannot repair. That is not an excuse. No, it is not. I need time, she said. The words cost her more than she would ever admit. Away from you. Away from this house. The Countess has invited me to Bath. I leave tomorrow. The devastation on his face was total. She watched him fight it. The war between his need to hold on and his understanding that holding on was exactly the problem, and she watched him lose. How long? He whispered. As long as I need. He did not come to say goodbye the following morning. His absence felt like a wound they had inflicted on each other. I have to be honest with you. This part of the story is the one that keeps me up at night. Not the danger or the revenge or the grand romantic gestures. This. Two people who love each other desperately, separated by the very intensity of that love. Both of them suffering. Both of them wondering if the thing they built can survive the weight of what he is. The separation lasted 3 weeks. They were the longest 3 weeks of Rosalind's life. The Countess was a gracious hostess, filling the days with walks and conversation, and the kind of sharp, perceptive company that made Rosalind understand how this woman had come to wield such extraordinary social power. But the nights were long, and the bed was cold, and the silence where Marcus's voice should have been was a presence in itself, vast and aching and impossible to ignore. She missed him. Not the grand gestures, not the devastating declarations. She missed the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the way he appeared in doorways as though summoned by her thoughts, the way he said her name, Rosalind, as though it were a word he had invented specifically to describe something sacred. On the 15th day, a letter arrived, not from Marcus, from his valet. His Grace has not eaten in 4 days. He does not sleep. He has dismissed the household from the East Wing and refuses all visitors. I have served His Grace for 12 years and have never seen him in such a state. I write to you, Your Grace, because I believe you are the only person who can reach him. She was in the carriage within the hour. She arrived at Ashworth Hall at dusk to find the house wrapped in an unnatural silence. The servants moved like spectres, speaking in whispers, casting frightened glances toward the East Wing. She went to his door, knocked. Silence. Marcus, open this door. Nothing. Then, from the other side, a voice she barely recognized, hoarse, scraped hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion. Go away. No. Rosalind. Open this door, or I will have your butler take it off its hinges. I'm not bluffing. The lock turned. The door opened, and she saw what 3 weeks of self-imposed exile had done to the Duke of Ashworth. He was gaunt, unshaven, hollow-eyed. The storm-grey eyes that had looked at her with such fierce, unshakable intensity were red-rimmed and empty. He gripped the doorframe as though it were the only thing preventing him from falling. "You came back," he said, as though he did not believe it, as though he had imagined this moment so many times that he no longer trusted his own perception. "Of course I came back. I burned the dossier. The morning you left, I wrote to Harcourt. I apologized. I have been sitting in this room for 3 weeks trying to become the man you deserve, and I am not certain I have succeeded, but I am certain of one thing." His voice shattered. "I cannot survive without you. I have tried. I cannot." She placed both hands on his face. His skin was cold. His jaw was rough with weeks of neglect. He leaned into her touch like a man leaning into sunlight after years underground. "Listen to me," she said. "I did not leave because you love me too much. I left because your love was becoming a weapon against people who did not deserve it. There is a difference between protecting me and destroying anyone who looks at me. I need you to understand that difference. I need you to choose every day to channel what you feel into devotion instead of destruction. I will. The words came out raw and immediate. I swear it, on Thomas's grave, on everything I am. Then we are finished with this separation. She brushed her thumb across his cheekbone. And you are going to eat something and sleep and stop terrifying your servants. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, though it broke halfway through. Then his arms came around her, carefully, as though she were made of something precious and breakable. And he held her in the doorway of his ruined sanctuary and breathed her in like oxygen. "I love you," he said against her hair, "in a way that frightens me, in a way I will spend the rest of my life learning to deserve." "You already deserve it," she said. "You have deserved it since the night you knelt on a cold floor and asked a woman with no shoes to be your duchess." He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were wet. She had never seen him cry, had not believed him capable of it, and the sight of it broke something open inside her chest that she suspected would never fully close again. "I will be better," he said. "Not perfect. I do not think I am capable of perfect, but better. I will fight this darkness in myself every day, because you deserve a man who protects you without becoming the thing you need protection from." "That," she said quietly, "is all I have ever asked." He kissed her then, not with the desperate, consuming hunger of their first kiss, but with something deeper, something that tasted like gratitude and hard-won wisdom and the kind of love that has been tested in fire and come through altered but unbroken. The true vindication came 3 months later at the Pemberton Winter Ball, the most coveted invitation of the season. Rosalind descended the grand staircase in midnight, blue velvet, sapphires blazing at her throat, and every eye in the ballroom followed her. She was no longer the invisible woman who had mended stockings by candlelight. She was the Duchess of Ashworth, and she moved through that glittering crowd with the quiet, unshakable assurance of a woman who had earned her place in fire. Marcus waited at the foot of the stairs. When he saw her, he stopped, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-breath. "Dance with me," he said. "We have not been announced." "I do not care." The string quartet struck up a waltz, and the Duke of Ashworth led his wife onto the floor before 300 of England's most powerful people. He held her closer than propriety allowed. He looked at her as though no one else in the room existed. "Everyone is watching," she murmured. "I know. I want them to watch. I want every person who ever made you feel invisible to see how the most powerful man in this room looks at you. I want every woman who whispered behind your back to understand what you are. And I want you," he pulled her closer still, "I want you to finally believe you were never invisible. You were just waiting for someone who knew how to see." When the waltz ended, the Countess of Pemberton took Rosalind's hands and said, loud enough for every nearby matron to hear, "My dear Duchess, you are the finest thing that has happened to this family and to this season. We shall expect you at every event hereafter." It was not merely acceptance, it was coronation. That evening, after the ball, Marcus took Rosalind's hand and led her through the frost-silvered grounds of Ashworth Hall to the family plot behind the chapel. Thomas's headstone gleamed white in the moonlight. Thomas Whitmore, soldier, brother, friend. He saved lives. He changed them. He is not forgotten. Rosalind knelt in the frozen grass and pressed her palm to the marble. "He did it, Thomas," she whispered. "He came for me, just as you promised, and he is everything you said he would be, everything and more." Marcus stood behind her, silent, patient, present, a warmth at her back against the cold December night. When she rose, he took her hand. Do you think he knows? She asked. Wherever he is. Marcus looked at her in the moonlight, his wife, his duchess, the woman he had loved for 7 years before he ever heard her voice, and his eyes held a certainty that came not from arrogance but from faith. He knew before we did, he said. He always knew. And somewhere beyond the grey English sky, a soldier who had given everything, his strength, his health, his life, so that two people could find each other, was watching. And he was, at last, at peace. This story reminds me why I started this channel, that feeling of escape, of justice, of love winning even when the odds are impossible. If you felt that too, you are exactly where you belong. Thank you for being here tonight. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, join this community. I would love to have you here for the next story. If you would like to support this channel while we work toward monetization, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/annuellemedu. Every bit of support means the world to me. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very soon.